Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome back to Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Morning, Nora. How you doing?
Very well, Brian. How are you?
Doing good. Yeah. How's everything on the west Coast as the heat is beginning to rise? We're recording this in late April, and man, the heat is rising here.
It's starting. Yeah, I think it's going to be 85 today, which and now. That's not too bad. And it's going to be a little cooler next week, which is unusual. But basically, we're not going to see 60 again until September or October. So that's just, it's over. Spring has sprung and summer is on its way.
Yeah, we know spring is here because, oh my gosh, the allergies. I can't tell you how
fast we're going through pollen count.
Oh my
high
gosh.
Pollen count.
Clients are coming up to me almost every other day with the empty tissue box saying, we need more. I'm thinking, I just put that out there 2 days ago. And it was like, allergies are just going crazy. And anybody who's ever lived on the East Coast knows, oh my gosh, the amount of pollen that is released here is just insane. So hopefully it'll be done soon.
Yes. Sacramento is called the city of trees. So like many places in California are not that tree-y, but Sacramento is. And I swear I washed my car yesterday, right? And then I basically just drive around. The next morning, it is covered with this thick layer of pollen.
It's green.
It's sort of like, wait a minute. It's only I washed you yesterday morning. This is not fair.
Yep.
Yeah, it's thick, man. It's thick here too. And we get all the pollen, plus we get all the, we've got farmland in every direction around us too. So we get a lot of wind that blows all of that pollen and grassland and stuff through us. So yeah.
One of my clients is from Korea, and I just saw her my last hour, and she said this is her first year really being here. It was last year, and from what I've heard, the first year you're in a new area, it may or may not affect you, maybe a little bit. She said, "Oh my gosh, I thought I had a cold for the last week. I thought for sure I had to be sick." And I said, "Nope. Welcome to DC. That's called pollen, and get used to it because it's going to be here for a while."
And if you're from Korea, it's not what you're used to, right? Very different trees, very different pollen. So the immune system's going, "What is this in my nose?"
Exactly. Well, the last few weeks, we're still celebrating sort of Bone Month here in May. This episode should be running toward the end of May. And we've talked about, different things that have happened when it comes to bones. Last week, we talked about the bone basics. And we thought, well, this week, let's talk a little bit about pathologies, things that you and your practice may run up against or even had it yourself. And, some of the issues that may, come about when you have had some bony issues. And what are the bony issues? Because, we all hear about the bones and things, but all we at first started thinking about was we have fractures. And it took us a minute to think of some of things.
Yeah.
And I was like, that. So thought, that'd be a good place to start today.
So when you think about fractures, what we often think about first, and I'm going to bring my bones up, but there will be some more YouTube, not a lot of audio, video, visual. We often think about a fracture of a long bone, like somebody breaks their arm, somebody breaks their leg, somebody breaks their tibia. And even when you think about that, we picture it as, it's a nice clean break and it just goes back together and zip, zap, zoop, everything is fine. It grows back. But a couple things about that. One is bones can break a lot of different ways. There can be what are called stress fractures or stress reactions, which are not complete. They don't go all the way through. The bone just gets irritated and weird. And a lot of times this happens in the tibia or in some of the foot bones. You can also have really a completely destroyed situation. Mm-hmm. So like a shattered bone where it's much harder to put all the pieces together. You can have what's called an open or a closed fracture. Closed fracture means the skin is integral. So there's a break, but it's inside. An open fracture means that it broke through the skin.
Yep.
Right. So those are just some common like things you might hear. And
Yep.
and levels of difficulty, right? Like a
Mhm.
clean long bone break will heal generally pretty well. A shattered break is a little trickier.
Little
One
trickier. That's
where
quite a bit, yeah.
it's a lot trickier, and one where it breaks through the skin, trickier yet. So you also have like gradations of difficulty there in terms of healing.
And something else to think about is when we have these fractures, because the younger we are, the faster, first of all, we're going to heal. But
Absolutely.
secondly, anybody who's had a kid who, gets one of these sort of green stick fractures where the
Hmm.
bone is still growing and it's still growing at a rapid rate. So it's not really necessarily a full fracture because it's going to heal so quickly. But you hear of that. You hear of that type of fracture.
And sometimes, to dive right into what happens sometimes when you're younger, is because I've had this several clients over the years who had let's say, a femur break when they were 7 or 8 or 9 or
Mm,
10, like younger, and they're not fully grown at all yet. And just even a simple straight ahead fracture, the bones then may grow at slightly different rates. And sometimes that client will end up with either a shorter leg or a longer leg because the femur bone just grew at a different rate on the injured side.
yeah.
So something to think about if your client has one of those things. You might just want to ask them if they ever had fractures when they were kids. That would be useful for you to know.
Yeah, especially in the long bones because they do take time. And if it was a clean break, it's going to take time for it to fuse together. And if it is when they're rapidly growing, anybody who's had children, I mean, in a summer, a
Yeah.
kid can grow 3 or 4 inches,
Yeah.
and that's very rapid. And if your body's trying to heal while the other side is rapidly growing, you can have some discrepancy between the two sides. And I mean, in both of our practices, we've seen a number of people who have, leg length discrepancies of anywhere from, I think the most I had was about 1.5 inches difference.
Mm.
And they had to have all their shoes, specially modified, but a quarter of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, very common, very common.
Yes, and often not symptomatic or problematic, but that
No.
depends.
Yeah.
One other thing we sometimes see in younger people is I have a tibia that I have up on the screen, and sometimes what'll happen in younger people is you'll get a fracture through the growth plate.
Mhm.
So instead of being like kind of in the belly of the long bone, it's right where the bone is actively growing. There's a growth plate at the end of particularly the long bones, which honestly stays cartilaginous for a while because that's the last place that's going to calcify because it has to reach its full length, right? So sometimes you get a fracture at the growth plate, and that can damage the growth plate. Which means it can either just decrease the length of that bone, like it won't grow as long, or sometimes the rate of growth on the two sides of the bone, like the right and the left side, or just the inside and the outside in a way, will go off. And sometimes you'll get some joint distortion from those circumstances as well. So those are not that common, but just things to think about, especially if you work with a younger clientele, a younger population, or you have kids who are prone to high levels of activity that lead to the occasional fracture.
I was watching some social media talking about Gen Xers, and it is so funny watching the kids nowadays where everyone has to have a helmet and have elbow pads and knee
Yeah,
pads to ride
yeah,
their
yeah.
bikes. And I'm thinking, we crashed on purpose. We would come down the hill at each other and like jousting, but without joust. We would just hit each other. I'm thinking, wow, we really are in a different place. But that's also the reason why I've had a number of bone breaks from when I was a
Mhm.
child.
Yeah,
Just
clearly.
that was what you did. And you went home and said, my hand doesn't seem to be moving right. And, so, you mentioned an open fracture. I actually had one of these. I fell out of a mango tree and
Oof.
landed between two roots. And one of my arms went to break the fall. And I had, basically the radius and ulna both sticking out of my wrist. And it was a terrible, terrible, situation. And I had to have surgery, and they were worried about losing the hand because I couldn't feel in it. So obviously I compressed a nerve or something, but they thought it might have
Yeah,
severed. So, kids, we do crazy things. And
yeah.
when you do, sometimes that's going to lead to that. And if you get one of those breaks in something like your growth plate, that can permanently change the rate at which you are going to grow. And like you said, it can definitely affect joint mechanics, especially the tibial plateau. because
Mhm.
if one side is growing at a different rate than the other or growing offset or whatnot,
Or
that
change
can
shape.
really,
Yeah.
exactly, you can really see one side may be more bow-legged or knock-kneed or something just because of that little change in the dynamics.
Absolutely. So those are some things just to to think about. One other thing to think about is how long it takes fractures to heal. So
Mhm.
smaller bones generally take less time, longer bones take more time, bigger bones take more time. If it's a fairly simple break and they're not having to reduce it, which means put it back in place, or do a minimal amount of reduction and then just let it heal. That can vary from 3 weeks to like 8 weeks
Yeah.
ish, roughly, again, depending on the size of the bone and where it is and other kinds of things. One thing that's good to note and to be aware of is a client who smokes can take almost twice as long for
Yeah.
bone healing, which is
Yeah.
that's a big deal. Like twice as long, that's a lot.
That's a huge
So,
deal.
yeah, smoke really interferes for whatever reason with bone production. So,
Is it the
something to think
nicotine
about.
itself, or is it something in the inhaling? I don't know the
No,
mechanisms
I don't
or
know.
behind
I
that,
just
so
know,
you're not
yeah, I
sure.
don't either. Yeah. I should have looked
Yeah,
it up, but I
but
don't know that.
yeah, and it does. I had shoulder surgery during the pandemic, and one of the things was they reduced one of my bone. They took, a chunk out of the bone, and the doctor said, "Look, it's going to take 8 weeks. It's going to take 8 weeks to heal because that's what bones relatively take. And now some people are faster, some are slower." Said, but a good rule of thumb is 8 weeks. And I remember as a kid, anybody with a cast, that was 2 to 3 months,
Yeah.
almost like clockwork. It was going to be, you're going to have a cast for 2 to 3 months. So it
Yep.
does take some time.
Now, with that in mind, things have changed a lot in terms of
Mhm.
treatment. So I also
Absolutely.
want to go back one step. So if you do have, for example, a shattered bone or a bone that broke into a bunch of little pieces, you'll typically have some kind of surgery to go in and stabilize all those bits and try to put them back in order with screws and plates and other kinds of fancy hardware to hold
Mhm.
the bone together while it grows. And then what you're trying to do is hold it together enough that then the bones will ossify and hopefully create more or less a solid bone that more or less matches the one that was there before it got fractured. And
Yeah.
hardware is problematic for many reasons, Brian. You got some hardware stories for us?
Oh, many, many. Literally this past weekend, I got sent a image, X-ray image, post-surgery. Client shattered her ankle,
Mm.
uh, tibia, fibula both broke right at the bottom, and so it was they needed, I believe it was 4 plates
Oh,
and ton of
Lordy,
screws to
Lordy.
fixate it. So
Yeah.
obviously it wasn't just a clean break. And this was a woman who's probably in her early 70s, late 60s, early 70s.
Mm.
So it's, again, you're talking about bones that aren't the strongest to begin with. We're not talking about a 20-year-old. We're talking about someone who's obviously a little bit older. And when you look at it, this is the closest thing to Frankenstein's monster that, when you
True.
see any of these kind of things, you're
Yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
that's in your leg, that's under the
Yeah.
skin.
Yeah.
And I mean, you and I have both seen, spinal ones, where they fuse, spines and whatnot. So we're used to seeing some of this stuff. But when you see other joints, I had a client who broke his hip. And now hip fractures are very interesting because they can be in a number of different places. And he
Yep.
broke his in 2 places. So he had what was called a honey dipper, which basically he broke his at the neck. So where the ball is, right behind the ball, where it narrows out, he broke that, as well as just below the greater trochanter. It was basically a horizontal fracture.
Yazo.
And yeah. And he actually said he heard this from the doctor after he did it, and he can attest to it. A femur fracture is the most painful thing you could ever experience. And he said he has never been in pain like this in his life. And
Yeah.
literally, what they do is they have to drill into the head, yep,
Yep.
from the outside,
They
and
kind
put a
of just
plate on
kind of
the
pin
outside.
right in here. Plate on the outside for that greater trochanter fracture, and
Yep.
then usually a pin that goes all the way through the neck up into the head for the neck fracture.
Yep.
Yep.
And what's interesting is it's called a honey dipper. And if you ever see an x-ray, it looks like that because it's the end piece that goes into the head actually gets wide, narrow, wide, narrow, wide, narrow. And it
Oh,
does that so that the bone will grow into it so that it won't
right.
back itself out.
Right. 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 Right.
So I found that very fascinating because he brought me his images and it was sort of a wow. The most interesting thing I found about this, though, it never bothered him. He said you could feel it, and we will talk about ossification of some of the screws and things in a minute because he didn't have a whole lot of meat on the outside of his greater trochanter, so you could feel where the screws actually were. But later in life, I knew him when he was starting in his 50s and in his early 70s, he needed a hip replacement in that hip, which would make sense.
Yeah.
But when I saw the image, he was missing half of the head of his femur and had no idea. And I mean half, like the upper half was gone. You could
Like
see
the
the honey
ball was
dipper.
gone?
The ball was gone. He still had full
Really?
function. He was doing lunges with
Wow.
me. He was doing squats. He had
Wow.
almost no pain until the very end. And
Ah.
I think that honey dipper fixated it just enough, and he must have had enough cartilage in other places because he said, "Oh, I had no pain until one day he woke up, and it's like that last little bit wears away." He said, "Ow, I don't know what's going on in my hip, but that's the one that was broken." And it kept getting worse and worse. And I said, "Well, go get an X-ray." And he brought me the image, and I was shocked at what I saw.
Yowza.
Yeah. So just keep in mind that what we think we're going to see isn't always what's there. And when it comes to things like post-surgery, because we've seen this in, anywhere from the neck to the spine to the knee, when hardware is put in, you really don't know what you're going to see and what you're going to get out of it. And they can be fully functional. And yet when you see the images, you think, wow, how is that functional? How does that work so well? But our bodies are so used to being able to balance that out and compensate. It's fascinating.
And one of the things that I always like to bring up there, whether it's arthritis, whatever it is strength. And sounds like this guy was working on strength.
Yep.
Remember that our joints don't actually rub up against each other. There's a little space there in a well-functioning joint. There isn't always, but in a
Yep.
well-functioning joint. And that space is caused by literally the muscular strength around it. So if you have enough strength, you can maintain or manage, a very damaged hip or a very damaged knee or a very damaged ankle for quite a while. There often comes a point where you can't anymore. But again, strength will just decrease that pressure and that pain of the bones rubbing against each other.
Yep.
Up to a limit, right? Up to a limit. And then you hit the limit and then it's like it's time for replacement.
And unlike other joints in the body, you have such thick ligament structures in the hip that were actually holding it together that kept it in place. And his muscular strength really did keep that at bay so many years. So it did its job.
So thinking about hardware, a couple things. One is oftentimes hardware is there forever, right? Usually the doctors put it in and they're just gonna leave it in. And oftentimes that works just fine. Like I've got more than one client where I can picture their hip x-rays in my mind, like you can, and picture all the weird things that are in there holding them together. But for example, my clients who've had ankle fractures, like Brian was talking about, who have plates on like their tibia and their fibula, perhaps, even higher up than just the ankle, like those are really close to the skin. If you take a moment and feel your tibia or your fibula, you've got a thin layer of skin and some tendons and connective tissue right over the bone. And so I've had more than one client who is, especially in that area, you could feel the screws on the outside of their leg, and they started to get some tendinitises just from the tissue rolling over the screws.
Yep.
And this was probably 4 or 5 years, I think, after their initial surgery. And so they went in and had the hardware taken out. The whole fracture had healed. They had the hardware taken out, and they did great. I mean, again, it was a surgery, but they recovered very quickly, and that just decreased that pain and allowed those tissues just to get a little more to be gliding and sliding a little more appropriately. So it decreased the pain and decreased the pressure.
And keep in mind, the older the client is, the thinner the skin is going to feel.
Yeah.
So if a client gets it when they're in their 30s, Well, they might have a lot more muscle there, especially if they did it in some kind of sporting activity. The chances are they had more muscle there. They get to be in their 60s and 70s and no longer as active. It's going to thin out. And that's usually when I start to
Yeah,
feel it. And you can really
that's
feel it
true.
around the knee, around the bone. And you're like, oh, wow, bump, bump, bump. You can feel the screw itself. And that's when I've noticed that they become very sensitive. Now, I haven't had
Hmm.
a whole lot of tendinopathy in these situations, but just the sensitivity of it.
Yeah,
So they have to wear
yeah,
like lower socks, or they have to modify it because just the movement of the skin over the
right. Or
screws
the pants over it, or
or the
yeah, or
pants.
socks or whatever. Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
And it just begins to irritate.
Hmm. And if you got a client with that, they've got hardware and it seems to be part of the issue, just have them, go back to their surgeon and say,
Yep.
hey, is it appropriate to take this out now? Because sometimes
Yep.
it is. If it's been years and years, generally the bone is ossified and it's fine. And if you take those screws out, it'll just ossify through those holes and you'll be good to go. So that's looking at fractures, looking at hardware. Um, one other thing, because a lot of times, this is what I was going to say before. There's a lot of differences in terms of how fractures are dealt with now than when, let's say, I was a kid, and probably when you were a kid.
Yeah.
Then the classic thing was they put you in a cast, right?
Yep.
They immobilize that area for 4 to 6 to 8 weeks or whatever's appropriate for the healing.
Yep.
So you are completely immobilized in that area for that period of time.
Yep.
And one of the things that we know about immobilization is that immobilization creates kind of profound weakness. So if you are immobilized for 2 solid months in your right arm, for example, it will take a minimum of 3 times that to recover the same level of strength that you had before. So, and that's in somebody who's kind of young and healing well. In an older person, you may
Mhm.
never quite recover it. So now they tend to do a lot less immobilization, or
Yeah.
for a lot shorter period of time. They might use a wrap, they might use an ace bandage, they might
Air
use
cast.
an air cast or a shoulder sling or something else, which basically keeps you from moving it. But they really oftentimes, again, depends on the doctor and the situation, how bad it is, but they'll often encourage you to keep it moving as much as you can within certain ranges,
Mhm.
because that keeps, number one, that helps the healing. So stimulating the bone growth, or the bone with the muscles that are attached to it, stimulates the bone to kind of lay down more bone. It also means that people don't get as dysfunctional after the healing is done.
Now, when you talk about dysfunction, I can tell you from my own experience when I shattered my wrist. And again, it was down just above the wrist. But they put me in a full elbow cast because they did not want me using it. I
Yeah,
was in the cast for 2 to 3 weeks max. Okay, the full arm cast. Then they cut that off and then they gave me just the wrist cast, up
forearm
to my
cast. Yeah,
forearm. I could not straighten out my elbow though for a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks. I had lost the ability. All the muscles had shortened significantly. I was 12. I think I just turned 13. Yeah, I just turned 13. I could not. And I was trying. I was trying to straighten it out because, a kid, I thought it's going to be like this forever. Oh, no. And it took at least the same length of time that I had the cast on to
yeah.
get my elbow straight again. So
And
just keep that in mind.
13, right?
I was
You
13.
were like young and active, and tissues are presumably in
Great
the
shape.
better shape of your life, right? Yeah,
Exactly. And so
yeah.
you could imagine how many times have we had a client put in a boot, for instance, or a knee
Hmm.
brace. And what happens is as soon as it comes off, and especially if it was a hard one, like a boot, they don't take it off. They sleep in it. They do everything in it. Well, we reduce the range of motion significantly afterwards. So you can
Hmm.
see if someone actually breaks a bone and they're put in a hard cast that goes all the way up. You remember those pictures that it goes all the way up mid thigh.
Yeah.
It's going to take some time for mobility issues for you to be able to recover all of that mobility that you had before. And like you said, depending on your age, some of that may not come back 100% unless you really work diligently at it.
And one of the things I think this is still true. I don't know anybody much who has a fracture, even I mean, compound fractures and surgery maybe, but basically who gets PT afterwards.
No, no.
I mean, usually I think they just assume like what going back to your ordinary activity is going to solve the problem.
Yep.
Uh, that's optimistic, I think. I've had people who broke a leg a long, long time ago, never really did much about it and still limp.
Yep.
Like still limp. And it's not because they need to, it's because they got in the habit of it after that cast was off and they didn't have the range of motion and they never quite recovered. So,
Yep.
I mean, we're in a really, really good position for somebody post any kind of a fracture. And once they've been cleared to move and exercise, to really make a profound difference in terms of their future functionality.
I've had
So,
a number of clients that have
yeah.
had that. One that I'm thinking of right now, I saw him earlier this morning. He fractured his ankle. Believe it or not, he was doing a step up exercise. He decided he needed a more instability. So what did he do is he put a balance pad on top of that.
Mhm.
Instead of the steps on top of a bigger balance pad, no, he did the exact opposite, went up, it slipped out from under him, and he broke his ankle. Well, he was in a solid boot cast for, I want to say at least 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks.
Wow.
And afterwards, and of course, we trained during that whole time, but didn't touch that. We found many, many ways that he could still exercise and work the other leg and still work everything else. And when that came off, he, of course, had significant atrophy on that side. His range of motion was horrible, but they never, and I said, so when do you start PT? And they said, no PT for me. They said, just
Yeah.
walking will get back everything. And I looked at him, and even he is not an exerciser, and he knew, he was like, yeah, that's not going to
He's like,
happen.
that's not going to happen. That's not going to work.
Not in your 60s. And I said, okay, well, we're going to have to double down now. And he's fortunately a very diligent exerciser. Again, he was doing a step up on a balance pad. He's a diligent person when it comes to it. But yeah, so don't expect the doctor to do a whole lot after they take the cast off. It's sort of like they look at the x-ray, that knitted up well, I did my job, you're on your own.
Exactly.
It'll come back, just give it time.
And I again, working with a lot of fractures, many of them do heal pretty well, and again, you kind of get the range of motion back. But things like the ankle, the elbow, the wrist, those are tricky. And like what I think is interesting about what you said, Brian, about your experience is how much the tissues lose mobility.
Yeah.
From being immobilized. They really do just kind of, they shorten up, and then those little fibers and the myofascial structure just gets shorter and shorter, kind of holding that where it is. And it takes time to regain that mobility. And, you think about mobility, and the ankle is kind of critical to function. And certainly the elbow is kind of critical to a lot of things. So yeah.
I mean, I've had a couple of people who have had wrist fractures 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And can't get into a plank position on their wrists.
Yep.
Because one can flex no problem, and the other side flexes to about 45 degrees, and they say, that's all I've got. And I'm thinking, and that's when I'll say, broken? I said, yeah, about 20 some odd years ago or 15 years ago, whatever it was. And it's like, yeah, okay, well, that might be what we got now. It's been so long, or let's work on a little bit of mobility
and see if we can get more
something back.
Yeah.
Because if they're in their 50s, you still got a lot of life left ahead of you. I want to see you be able to be at least functional, especially if you want to end up playing something like, tennis or golf or anything like that. You kind of need to have some flexion extension in your wrist.
Yeah, and some mobility, because otherwise it's just going to get uncomfortable too. You're just going to keep whacking it. The place that I probably worked the most on is ankle fractures.
Yeah, with dancers, I can totally see that.
Yeah, and also tennis. I'm one who's a tennis player, some dancers, etc. But man, when you really fracture, like I'm thinking about your client you just mentioned, when you fracture the tibia and the fibula close to the ankle joint, that range of motion, I don't know that I've ever seen it really fully. I'm not sure that I've ever really seen full good ankle and foot mechanics recover well. It's a long process, and it's it just seems like everything stiffens up in there, and then I'm not sure what all the scar tissue does, but boy, that gets really tricky. I've had to work really hard on getting range of motion back and stuff for my ankle fracture clients.
And something that we have to keep in mind, especially because mobility is so big in fitness right now and has been for quite a while, is the body wants to be stable. So when there is a break, the physician wants that joint to get stable again. So they're going to
Yeah.
put you in a cast. They're going to do whatever they have to do to stabilize that joint. And afterwards, they're just looking to see how stable it is. That's their
Yeah. That's their criteria for success.
criteria. That's their success model, is how stable is that? Can you walk? Great. Are you stable? Yes. Way to go. I did my job. You're on your way. However, for optimum joint mechanics, we do know that we need a certain amount of mobility and a certain amount of flexion and extension. And how many times have we seen these clients walking down the hall and you're just looking your way, man, they've got a hitch in their giddy up. You can see it a mile away.
Yep.
And you can't quite tell what it is, but there's something going on. And when you do ask them, they say, oh yeah, I broke my ankle. And therefore it is up to us to get some of that back. But you're right. I've seen 90% recovery, and that's the high side. I'll be honest, that's the high side. But if they get 90%, I'm thrilled.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So again, this is something where you might have a client who had this years ago and is at a plateau with their healing from whatever happened with them. I often find too that just looking at strength deficits, if something's been immobilized or even in a minimum amount of immobility, but just not on crutches or with a brace or whatever for a long time, you'll get so much strength loss. And it can really take a while to do that. And just a reminder, in the Pilates world, if you continue to do bilaterally symmetrical exercises like double leg footwork, you don't make improvement in the weaker side. The dominant side just takes over. So it's a real reminder that if I see that deficit and I really know I'm going to work on a strength deficit, whatever the cause, I've got to address that leg alone. I've got to work on that leg all by itself a fair bit to even begin to get close to balancing the dominant leg. So that's just one of those things to remember, right? Like, yes, working is great, but you always want to make sure you really address that specific strength deficit, because it will not happen if you do everything bilaterally for a while. It will just, that dominant leg will just stay dominant, and you really won't get the strength gains you want on that damaged side, that injured side.
I find a 3-to-1 ratio in that sense really works well in my experience.
It's just like 12-4 or.
Well, I'll do it in sets. I'll do sort of one set on both. Then I'll do a second set and a third set on the side that was injured. Nice. And the clients will often ask me, why are we doing so much? I said, we got to get it back. Now, one thing I will say to really enhance my dorsiflexion, because that's what I find. I find plantar flexion, they get back for some reason a lot easier than dorsiflexion.
Yep.
What I love to do, and you and I both have machines that do this. We both have reformers. I like jumping and using the jump board, because when you go down, it forces your heel to stay down. And I say, keep that heel down as long as you can. And I'll do single-legged and really load through the ankle, load through the foot, and explode up, and then land toe to heel. So it gets a little bit of that plyometric action going on. Plus, it's getting the fascia as well, because we're doing that rhythmic motion. We're getting that elastic recoil in there. And I find the combination really does work. And I've got multiple machines that do sort of that jumping, that I can take them down to like 5 pounds of their body weight. So they're not lifting that much. I've got a shuttle machine that I use. And then we can work our way up, but it works that range of motion. And I find that really does make a world of difference. And, they can't do that standing. They weigh too much. I mean, their bodies are not ready to do that. Yeah. But on a reformer, on the shuttle, works great.
And my only comment in there is just, make sure that they're healed.
Oh, right?
So this is all in the post. But that's fabulous, because again, you're getting that dynamic action, you're getting that elastic recoil, you're getting those tissues to have to respond, and respond kind of quickly. And that's a really, really useful thing for that. A couple of other things we wanted to talk about were some structural issues in the bones, that sometimes the bones are just have a different shape to them or have some other issues that can lead to trouble. And I was going to talk about the spine, couple issues in the spine. So again, once on the pictures, I've got a little picture of the back of the pelvis. And there's a couple things that can happen here in the lumbar and the sacral area. One is that you can get a non-fusion of the top of the sacrum.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like S1, S2 don't quite fuse either completely. So you've really kind of got an extra vertebra there, or only one side fuses. And along with that, or in another option here, is what's called sacralization of L5. And again, in the picture I've got a nice L5 vertebra or a nice model, and it's got a nice sticky outy transverse process. That sticky outy transverse process may attach itself to the ilium. And that's called sacralization of L5. So it basically means that the L5 becomes like the sacrum. Now, if either of those things are symmetrical on both sides, so either you're fully not fused in the sacrum or both sides are sacralized in the L5, that's a better situation.
Mm-hmm.
The challenges that I've had are when a client has only one side that's either fused, if it's the sacralization, or is not fused if it's the sacrum. And in that case, you have different mobility on the two sides of the spine. Those two joints are doing two different things. And that's been an interesting challenge with a few clients I've worked with that, like finding what is neutral. All these things are just really tough. Finding a neutral, figuring out what causes trouble, what doesn't cause trouble. Because if you think about it, right, sometimes if there is, like, let's say there's a sacralization where there's just a little bit of space, like one's fully fused and one has a little space between the transverse process and the ilium. Well, if I side bend to that side, I may push that that vertebra, which is a little bit of an elongated transverse process, into that ilium, and that's just not comfortable. So that's something I found. I've had to do some padding up with different areas and stabilization like mad, and just trying to really work with what works for that client, and then strengthen them in the ranges that they can tolerate in terms of flexion and extension, lateral flexion and rotation, of whatever those are appropriate, and just really work on those very, very consciously and very kind of slowly and carefully, and seeing how they respond.
And one of these type of situations also may be one of those know when correcting is not correct moments.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
some people try and overcorrect situations like this and think, well, we just need more side bending, or we just need more of this. The body has an amazing way to compensate, especially if you're born with this or you grow into this or whatnot. We talked about this during our scoliosis episode a while back. Some people who have scoliosis but have no pain, their body has figured out a way to compensate, but you can kick that hornet's nest if you tick it off. So there are times when, like you said, you want to strengthen them. We want to work with it, but we don't necessarily want to anger it or do something that could make it worse. So that's just something to keep in the back of your head. We're there to strengthen. So you're absolutely right. Finding that neutral spine, finding that position that works best for them, that we can strengthen them, where we can keep them relatively pain-free. That's the way to go. That's our greatest starting position.
And one thing I'd also say about that, because I mean, this is true in any case, but in these guys particularly, if they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, something, right? If they're an older person, right? Even a younger person, but particularly as an older person, is notice what their compensation patterns are now, right? Because those may be functional for them. Like if they really rotate well to the right, but don't like to go to the left, whatever the situation is, when you're assessing them, take a note of what their compensation patterns are. Because again, you may need to just reinforce those compensation patterns. You may not need to work against them a whole lot. And that's just, that's one of those things that, particularly as Pilates instructors, we're always looking for symmetry. And sometimes you just have to let that go and just what's going to work, what's pain-free on right side, what's pain-free on the left side. And they may be two very, very different things.
Something else to think about in these situations are bone spurs. We do see those. Best example that I've come across is when it's in the cervical spine.
Yeah.
And this is going to be the person who, when you do your initial assessment, can turn their head all the way to the left, no problem. They go to the right and they get stuck. And you ask them, is that as far as you can go? They go, yeah. You say, does it hurt? No. It just literally, they're up against the wall. It's like pushing against concrete. It's not going to move to them. And in that situation, they've got what they've got. So that's their range of motion. No matter what I do flexibility wise or movement wise, is probably not going to do anything to a bone spur. And if they are prone to arthritis in any way, through their spine, you may see that in the lumbar, you may see that in the cervical, you may see that in the thoracic. When they go to rotate, like you said, they rotate really well to one side and they go to the other side and they sort of get stuck. They just, and that's it. That's as far as I go.
And it's a hard end feel. So for those of you, like if any of you have ever had a neck spasm, like a levator spasm, which most of us have gotten at some point, like we wake up like we can't turn to the right or the left. It's very different. That feel like as soon as you try to go in that direction, it's more soft tissue. Plus it's acute. It's like, can't go to the right. And in a couple of days, you'll probably be fine or whatever. But in this case, it's not that. It's like, I'm fine to the right. And then I go to the left. It doesn't hurt. I just can't go. It's a very different end feel when it's bone than when it's soft tissue. Yep. And that's just, just a good thing to be aware of for you and with your clients, just like try to figure out what the sensation is that they're having and figure out whether, again, it's acute, came on suddenly, it's much more likely to be soft tissue, or, it's kind of like, oh yeah, I know, I never really been able to turn well to the left and, it's just getting worse over time. That's more likely to be just a bony issue.
And I find that baby trainers and even Pilates instructors, when they don't know, again, you want symmetry. We want to be able to, why you can't turn your head that way. You have to be able to. So they begin to try and force it. And that's the last thing you should do. That's the last thing that person needs, because again, that structure at that point, the bone has grown. You're not going to be, you do not want to fracture anything. You really don't want to injure them. And I've seen that even in the lumbar spine, where they side bend to one side, no problem. They side bend to the other. It's like, book, they get stuck. And our initial reaction is, oh, it must be muscular. You can always ask them and say, do you feel a stretch? No. Nothing feels locked up? No, that's as far as I go. Okay. So there's something blocking in there that's preventing that. And we see that in our facet joints sometimes. We do get that facet joint. We can get some ossification, some bone spurring, and that can limit their range of motion.
One other thing in terms of thinking about the spine is, we talked about the sacralization and sacrum not fusing, but in the upper body, I've had a couple of clients who've had an extra rib. So C7 has at least part or some of very long transverse processes, basically, but essentially it's like an extra rib up there. And that's caused some interesting cervical issues. Again, range of motion changes are for sure a little bit odd, and a lot of discomfort for them too, because there's just a lot of things up there that now when they're moving, they're actually kind of getting these sort of bones that may or may not be, because they don't fuse to the sternum in that case. They're just kind of hanging out like little extra bones there that are in a place where they really shouldn't be. So just another weird things to think about, that the body isn't always symmetrical. One other thing while I'm talking about that, I had a client who I was working with for a while. She was actually an instructor, and everything acted like she had a leg length difference. And so, I'm assuming she had a leg length difference. So I'm kind of doing the things I usually do with that. It didn't really work very well, which was always interesting. That's like, what's really going on? Then she went to an osteopath and got some x-rays taken. And what was interesting to me was it wasn't a leg length difference. It was a very different shape of her right and left pelvis.
Oh.
Right. So like when I'm looking at her, the right ilium was higher than the left ilium, for example, right? I did like my little 3-point test and the whole side was higher on one side than the other. But it wasn't a leg length difference. It was that one side of the ilium was shorter and smaller. And the acetabulum faced in a different direction. So, again, that's getting a little obscure, but sometimes, when you think, as I often say, if it doesn't look and smell like a duck, and it's probably not a duck. So when this takes time and practice. When you see a lot of things and you see a lot of issues with clients, you get to know what's kind of usual and what's kind of unusual. And and I was really, really glad with her. Like I kept saying, you've got to go check this out, because this doesn't make sense. This isn't what I've usually seen in any of these circumstances. And you're not responding the way most clients do. So something's different. And in her case, it was that her bony structure was really like night and day. It was, two very different bony structures inside. And so we had to work each leg independently. Like, this is what the right leg needs. This is what the left leg and hip need. And we had to work that way to get some results. We couldn't do it bilaterally because it just kept her in a funny position.
Interesting. Interesting. I wanted to say one other thing about bone spurs that
Yeah.
chances are you may come up against this in your practice. If it's in the shoulder joint or the hip
Mm,
joint,
mm.
because it's due to arthritis. Okay. Those are areas that, again, they have a lot of freedom of range of motion. These are the ones that are going to feel like they get stuck. Flexion, no problem. Or abduction, no problem. Flexion, and they go to turn a little bit and it's just like locks. And it's like, oh, but they can get around it with no problem. It's like, okay, now that's an early stage. I had one gentleman who was a diehard golfer, and one of his shoulders kept getting worse and worse and worse. And the doctor actually said, okay, we have to go and clean up the bone spurs. There's just too many. You don't need a replacement, but you need to clean up the bone spurs. Well, when they went in, they removed so much material. He never had a good working shoulder again. He was in his upper 80s at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he never fully recovered from that. And now in the hip, especially, there's something called the Faber test, which if anybody has crossed your leg, where you take your ankle and put it on the opposite knee and just let your knee fall to the side, that's similar to a Faber test, usually done lying down, where you cross the client, you bring the foot by the opposite knee is bent to 90 degrees, and just drop it to the side. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're going to see, and this is very, very indicative of pre-hip replacement, is one goes down with no problem and the other side stays up and barely moves, barely goes into rotation. They may be functional walking, they may be functional doing steps and all of this, but they start to lose that rotation. That external rotation in that position begins to become more and more limited. So just be aware that you may see some of these things and it may not be muscular. We go to do a piriformis stretch, and it's very common to do sort of that figure 4, crossing ankle over the knee and bending forward or something. And you go to have them do that, and they say, I can't do that. I physically can't. It may not be purely musculoskeletal, or maybe not be just muscular. It may be skeletal. So just be aware.
Yeah. And you can't, in my experience with that, I can't tell that so much because I've had that many times, and I've said, okay, well, let's work on the psoas, let's work on some other things, and I've gotten the range of motion back. Other times I haven't. So really, without an X-ray and somebody else to do that diagnosis, I'm not always going to, again, if I try some soft tissue stuff and doesn't make any difference, I'm going to assume it's a bone spur. But it's just that's just one of those things, like, you may want to get them checked out if you're really looking at that. Because if they are losing that kind of range of motion, you also kind of want to know how far along that hip is in terms of a progress towards a replacement or other kinds of issues.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. We covered quite a bit today, more than I expected.
So fractures, hardware, growth plate issues, right, that might happen with kids. We looked at some unusual bone situations. Bone spurs. Yeah, that's pretty. I think we got a few of the normal bone things in there.
Absolutely. And what we did not get into, and we can do it at a later date, is arthritis. Because there's 2 different types. We didn't want to dive into that too deeply, just because that's an episode or two
It's an episode of arthritis is a huge issue. It's a very, very, very common diagnosis. It does relate to the bones, at least osteoarthritis. Well, they both do sort of, but osteoarthritis certainly does. And bone spurs and stuff are all versions of arthritis, or can be. But basically, what you do with it, how you work with it, motion is lotion, all those things.
Yep.
An episode all on their own.
Exactly. So do us a favor. If you like what you heard today, give us a like, a subscribe, a comment, all of the things on social media. You can always see us on Instagram at Moving Combos. You can reach us at movingcombos@gmail.com. Hit that like and subscribe button. Please subscribe to us each week, so we just show up in your inbox every Tuesday at midnight. We drop, and you can also check us out on YouTube. It's under Mind, so look up Brian Ritchie, and you will see all of our episodes. They're there, and our numbers are rising, so that's always nice to see. So the more you hit the like and subscribe and comment, the more it'll get out there, so we really do appreciate it. And until next week, I'm Brian Ritchie for Nora St. John. We'll see you next time.